Hi everyone, my name is Haley Wilding and I'm going to be talking about the preservation of the Burgess Shale fauna and the evidence it has for evolution. To begin, I'd like to share the quote by Simon Conway Morris. He has done a lot of studies on the Burgess Shale, and he said in his book, The Crucible of Creation, he stated that the Burgess Shale is not unique, but for those who study evolution and fossils, it has become something of an icon. It provides a reference point and a benchmark, a point of common discussion, and an issue of universal scientific interest. I thought that was a really great quote to introduce my topic because the Burgess Shale is known for its collection of soft-bodied organisms from the Cambrian explosion. And what I'm going to share with you is the formation of the shale and why that's important, the different stresses and the different reasons why the Cambrian explosion may have occurred, and continuing evidence and studies that are going on today that will help us to better understand the past and what happened then. So Charles D. Walcott, a geologist for the Smithsonian Institute, was sent out on a fossil discovery mission in 1909. And while he was hunting in the Canadian Rockies, he came upon soft-bodied organisms that were preserved exquisitely in the Burgess. And so he named the body of rock that he found these in the Burgess Shale. You can see Charles Walcott up here in his very stylish outfit, and he came back year after year for a while with different colleagues so that they could record and log all the different fossils they were finding. This is a fossil, I think, of Pacaya, the first chordate recorded. And you can see how all of the soft parts of the fossil have been beautifully preserved. Okay, so the origin of the Burgess Shale, we're going to go over that a little bit. So it began to form during the Cambrian Earth. The Cambrian Earth is a time period from about 550 to 540 million years ago. And as you can see, it looks a lot different than the Earth we know today. The largest continent was called Gondwana land, and the other continents were Siberia, Kazakhstania, Baltica, Laurentia, and the only one I recognized when I first learned about this was China. And you can see how the landscapes also differed greatly. Most of it was lowlands. You had a lot of shallow seas around the continents like we do today. And you have just a little bit of mountains. Not a lot, but that's okay at this time. So why was the shale in the Burgess Shale such a great preservation rock? So fossil-bearing rocks usually are sedimentary rocks that form under low energy environments. What that means is there's not a lot of turbulence, there's not a lot of things that would crush or destroy the organisms, so that when the organisms die, they can settle out of the water and be buried so that they can be preserved. So shale and limestones are usually the rocks you find the fossils preserved in. And off to the coast of Laurentia, you could see that that was a perfect area for the Burgess Shale to form. In the last slide. So Lucy A. Wilson and Nicholas J. Butterfield, they had a hypothesis that sedimentary compositions of the sand or the clay or whatever organisms would be buried in would have an effect on the preservation. So for their study, they killed two organisms. So this is the Nereus. It's the worm-like structure here. It's a polychaete. I don't know how to pronounce that very well. And then also the kraken, which is like this shrimp-looking crustacean. And so they buried these organisms in 4 different compositions of sand. One was high in a kaolinite clay mineral. One was high in a calcite carbonate mineral. One was high in quartz, which is a silicate mineral. And the fourth one was also another clay mineral called montmorillonite. And they mixed these with salt water, trying to mimic the conditions that would have occurred during the Cambrian. And after 4 months, they exhumed the carcasses to observe the rate of decay and preservation. And this illustration shows the results really well. So they noticed that the sediments composed of calcite, quartz, and montmorillonite only preserve little bits and pieces. You can see here of the Nereus and here of your Kragen. Only little bits and pieces of them were preserved in those compositions, like the jaw or other hard parts, while the kaolinite-rich sand preserved organisms remarkably well. You could see that the kaolinite-rich sand and the calcite sands, they were flattened, but all the organs and bone structures were preserved and were still distinguishable if they needed to like run tests or anything on them. And then the montmorillonite sand and the quartz sands didn't flatten the organism, but it resulted in a large cavity being formed, and the organism would deteriorate, leaving this huge void behind. As you can see, this is a really good illustration of that and here as well. So they concluded at the end of this study that the composition of the sand had a great effect on the preservation, and that in order for the soft-bodied organisms to be preserved in a shale like the Burgess Shale, they would have to have a clay-like mineral, kind of like kaolinite, that would preserve it and not leave a void or anything like that, so that we could study the whole organism, bones and organs and everything. So over time, Laurentia became known as the North American craton. So the brown part of this image is North American craton. And as time goes by, sedimentary rocks get buried over time. So how did the Burgess Shale get to a point where Dr. Walcott just happened upon it in the Canadian Rockies? How did it appear in a mountain belt? The answer is mountain building events. So that was just a little illustration about how this would have formed. And these processes are called orogenies, the mountain building events. So a smaller continent of Laramide and Sevier, they came and they crashed into the western side of Laurentia. And as they did that, as you saw in that illustration, it forced the rocks to push up and form mountains. And so that's how we get the Rocky Mountain chain from northern Canada clear down to northern Mexico. And that's how the rocks were exposed, so we could find them. So what is the Cambrian explosion? I hinted at this earlier in the presentation. The Cambrian explosion occurred approximately 541 million years ago. And because of the Burgess Shale and its preservation, scientists have been able to gain amazing insights into the diversification of organisms. So Cambrian explosion is unique because before then, in a time period called the Ediacaran, most organisms were single-celled and very simple. But during the Cambrian explosion, they started to develop multicellular bodies, and they became larger, and all the major body plans evolved. So you can see we are of the family chordate, so animals with backbones. So we developed during the Cambrian explosion our body structure. And then we have anthropods, and we have all sorts of different things, sponges, we have starfish and worms, and they all these body plans started to develop during the Cambrian explosion. So we know that the Cambrian explosion happened. The thing that scientists are trying to figure out now is, why did it occur? Why was there such a huge diversification of life? And all the hypotheses that they have come up with and everything can be reduced down to three main categories: evolutionary stresses, developmental stresses, and ecological stresses on an organism. So we're going to break each of these down. Environmental stresses, these are where the environment has changed, allowing for new adaptations, or the availability of nutrients drastically changed, or oxygen increased in the atmosphere, allowing for organisms to be bigger. Phosphorus is essential to the creation of DNA, cell membranes, teeth, and bone formation. So with the increase in phosphorus, they were able to make better structured bodies, and they were able to be larger because of the oxygen. Before the Cambrian, Earth was in a period of glaciation. So off to the side here, I have a picture of what has been dubbed the snowball Earth. And so as the glaciers began to melt and retreat, it opened many ecological niches for organisms to fill. And so there was a great diversification because there was all these new places to go and live. And because of the increase in oxygen and the melting of the glaciers, the seawater composition changed, increased in salinity, allowing for more organisms to live there and have more interactions and things like that. So those are three environmental stresses that could have caused the Cambrian explosion. Developmental stresses. This hypothesis suggests that the multicellular organisms were already developed before the Cambrian, and therefore only diverged after. And so in this image, you can see that there was the development of multicellular organisms approximately at this point. And then they diversified during the Cambrian, and then they kind of just flatlined it after that. And so this suggests that there was environmental triggers that had to occur for them to diversify. So the environmental triggers, there was two different hypotheses within this: the deep divergence, which helps to explain. One second, that's my spot. Which helps to explain, like, it's backed up by the molecular clock studies, but it's challenged by the fact that there's a lack of bilaterian organisms. So bilaterian organisms didn't show up until after the Cambrian explosion occurred. And the shallow divergence relies heavily on the fossil record. But because of this heavily reliance, it's weakened because it can't explain any of the diversification or the complexity that occurs in the organisms. So, ecological stresses, this one becomes a little bit more complicated because it kind of turns into which came first, the chicken or the egg. Adaptive radiation, they think this one occurred because there was a mass extinction of the Edicarian fauna previously. Predator prey, they think this happened because it may have stimulated the evolution of skeletons, like for protection. So they might have developed a harder outer shell, or they may have developed things that would better rip off the shell. So they don't know if the organism's mechanisms for ripping off shells developed first, or if the hard parts of the organisms developed for protection. So this suggests that there could have been a early experiment in different body types as organisms tried to figure out which way and how they were going to protect themselves from organisms. And you can see in this illustration, this Cambrian organism is eating this Cambrian organism. So, and you can notice how this may have been a soft-bodied organism, and this developed this long tubular mouth to catch it. Maybe it was faster or something. I don't know for sure. Limited species interactions. So this hypothesis suggests that there was just so much land and area that species didn't really interact with one another. As species became more numerous and multiplied, they were forced to start to interact with each other. That helped to develop the different body types. And the last one is evolution of zooplankton. So zooplankton, when they died, they would sink from the surface down to the ground, providing more nutrients for burrowing animals. So these burrowing animals would mix up the dirt and things and make it so that nutrients would be released back into the water. And burrowing animals also provided food for other organisms, and they would sometimes that provided more nutrients for underwater organisms. Burgess Shale, after we take into account everything that we've talked about, how it formed off of the coast of Laurentia and it has amazing preservation. It also, because of that amazing preservation, we are able to learn a couple evolutionary principles really well. So one of them is descent with modification. This is Charles Darwin's theory, and it is basically the simple passing of traits from parent to progeny. So as recorded in the fossil record, you can see how different animals would swing from one characteristic to another over time. And so, like just with the beak of the finch, like when there was a drought, the population would swing to the larger beak finch. And when there was lots of water and more seeds, then it would switch to the smaller beak, just like it would happen in the environments of the Cambrian. And then as these things were switching back and forth, there would be transition fossils. And transition fossils are the in-between species. And so they provide the physical evidence showing how evolution occurred. So descent with modification is very slight changes in the body type, while transition fossils show the larger scale evolution of an organism. So with these light changes, they're fossilized, we're able to see how they evolved and where all of the families of organisms came from today. Yeah. And so, in conclusion, the Burgess Shale is an amazing key to the past. And we are still continuously studying it because we've learned so much from the Burgess Shale, but there's still so much to be discovered and to be studied. A couple of these studies are as new technologies have begun to develop in things, we noticed that the environment is interesting because oxygen-rich environments tend to lead to decay of the organisms before they can be fossilized. So this is a big area of study because they're trying to figure out why this occurred. Because usually fossils only get preserved in interaction between species. They want to know more if the organisms developed and changed because they had to start interacting with. So they're trying to study the interaction taking place in the fossil record. And then the organic preservation potential of organisms. So they're trying to see if certain types of organisms preserve better than others, which we know that hard parts of organisms preserve much better than soft parts because soft parts decay before the liquefaction process can begin. And so, in closing, the Burgess Shale is a really amazing body of rock, and it provides amazing insights and things into evolution and why things evolve. It's been something that scientists, since 1909, scientists have been trying to figure out how and why organisms diversify. And I just want to requote Simon Morris saying that the Burgess Shale is not unique, but for those who study evolution and fossils, it has become something of an icon. It provides a reference point and a benchmark, a point of common discussion, and an issue of universal scientific interest. So as time goes on, the Burgess Shale will continue to bring answers and continue to bring questions. And it's just an amazing piece of knowledge for us to continue to discover. I'm really excited to see what they have in the future.